All right. It is currently 9:05, 9:04, 9:04. So I'd like to thank you all for coming for the third regional WIS-TECH training. Yay. Who made it to the first two? All right. Who made it to the second one? All right. So it's wonderful to have you all back here. We will look to see how we're going to be continuing this education opportunity in the future. This next year, we'll be examining that and asking for your input. So if you wouldn't mind filling out those training evaluations, telling us what you did and didn't like, and also what format you prefer as far as education. Do you like conferences? Do you like webinars? Do you like these smaller meetings? We'll be able to do all sorts of stuff. We're interested in your feedback. So I'm going to hand off the mic to Cindy, and then I want to thank you again for all coming today, and I'll talk to you later.
Hi, I'm Cindy Piekler. I'm the Senior Assistive Technology Specialist here at Independence First. Now, how many of you know what independent living centers are? Awesome. Awesome. So then I don't have to explain our philosophy to you. Independence First is the independent living center that serves Milwaukee, Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee County. And we also coordinate the two statewide assistive technology programs of the Mobility Store and WizLoan. So those programs are coordinated here, although they exist in all of the independent living centers. And a little later today, we are going to give you a tour of Independence First, and we have built in some really nice features to this organization to make it accessible to people with all disabilities. And we also have a couple of assistive technology resources here that are fairly unique, and we're really happy to show them to you. So welcome, and we're going to have a good training today. Oh, one last thing. If you need to get into our Wi-Fi, use the public Wi-Fi. There's no password required. And for those of you who need to take a break, the bathrooms are right across the hall.
Okay, I'm going to switch mics and hopefully not get too much feedback. And I've already lost my glasses.
They're on your shirt.
They're on my shirt. That's because I don't normally put them there. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll do a little introduction, and then I just want to kind of get a feel for, what my audience is today, because, we primarily dabble in children, so this is kind of nice to be able to talk to a broader, wider audience. My name is Stacie Heckendorf. Am I loud enough, or am I going in and out? We're good? Okay. I am the school audiology consultant for the Department of Public Instruction, or also part of the outreach services for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind, which is part of the much bigger umbrella of WESBHH, Wisconsin Educational Services Program for the deaf and hard of hearing. So it's always interesting when people are like, well, what address is that? We have offices all over, so we're spread all over the state. But I just want to get a feel for, so do all of you work for independent living centers, and primarily coordinators, service coordinators for folks that come to the centers? Okay. So today, Lisa gave me kind of a long, lengthy list of information she wanted me to cover. So in 90 minutes, you're going to get Audiology 101 kind of across the board. So hopefully, it'll be a little bit of a lot of things. If you have questions, my contact information is at the very end of the slideshow. You can always call, send me, if you need more information or additional resources. I've tried to put the resources in there, because we know a lot of people come to trainings and you don't meet somebody who needs the resources until 2 years down the road. And you're like, oh, I remember that training in Milwaukee. What did they tell me? So hopefully, we will give you some new information and some things to think about. So with our time here today, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about hearing loss statistics. How many people are we talking about? Where does it stem from? What are some additional risk factors? What might be some reasons that people will come to you for hearing-related services? We're going to do a little bit of general background related to just signs of hearing loss. I do have educational impact of hearing loss in here, mainly because that's where my focus is, but it will still give you kind of what sets the stage of depending upon when people experience their hearing loss, if you meet somebody who's had it from a very young age. A little bit of, not so much anatomy, but really the ear and how it works and where can things go wrong. We'll touch on some newborn hearing screening, just very brief, like what's happening, how are we finding those babies very, very young. A little bit of testing, like how do we identify hearing loss to begin with. And then go through some different types of hearing loss, some different levels of hearing, what's the difference between a mild hearing loss and a profound hearing loss, or what might make somebody identify as deaf. And then just a very, very brief introduction to amplification. And then later today, Laura will go into some more of the assistive tech pieces. So I'm really kind of setting the stage for the rest of the things that you'll learn today. Okay, so related to the kids, and again, I've kind of tried to do the whole width, from kids to adults, to kind of give you that broad scope. Really, it's one of the most common developmental disorders that can be identified at birth. Most babies are tested before they leave the hospital. The statistics tell us that more than 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So, it's a whole new learning process for families when they identify their child has a hearing loss. It depends on what statistics you're looking at. We do know, even though we might be 2 to 3 children per 1,000 at birth, those numbers tend to go up through the elementary and high school ages because of late onset hearing loss or some progressive hearing losses or other syndromes. So really about 9 or 10 kids per 1,000 or 1 per 100. According to the CDC, 14% of school-age kids have been found to have some degree of hearing loss. And this is kind of a new statistic for us, is that 12% of children, 6 to 19, have some amount of noise-induced hearing loss. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, like why might that be happening for children? And again, this is just the resource if you like numbers, there's a few more for you. Interesting statistic, men are twice as likely than women to have hearing loss, but again, that may be tied to that noise-induced hearing loss piece. Right now, it's identified that 1 in 8 people in the United States have some amount of hearing loss, or translates to 30 million people 12 years or older. Obviously, presence of hearing loss increases with age due to anatomical changes with the aging process. We have approximately 25% of adults 65 or older have hearing loss, which increases to 50%. So that 10 years makes quite a bit of difference in the amount of folks who may be coming to you with some amount of hearing loss. So where does the hearing loss come from? So risk factors are very similar to causes or why you might have a hearing loss. You can have a late onset or progressive hearing loss. So a lot of the adults who come to you may have not had any hearing loss until they're well into their adult years, 40, 50, 60 years old. For many children, if they have a history of recurrent ear infections or otitis media, it may resolve 1 or 2 episodes, but the more times that it occurs, the more likely you are to have a permanent hearing loss related to that. There's any number of syndromes or craniofacial type anomalies that are also related just to hearing loss due to bone structure or other kinds of physical differences. You can result and have a hearing loss and result to a head trauma, an accident. We also know that ototoxic drugs, for a lot of our kiddos, their hearing loss is not because they were born as a preemie. They end up with the hearing loss because of the oxygen that they need when they're born and the medications, or where we also see it is in cancer patients, is that sometimes the life-saving treatment results in the hearing loss, and sometimes it's not immediate. It can be a year or 2 years later, so really important for those folks to kind of be monitored because it's not an immediate kind of effect. It can take time over years. And then also noise exposure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. What are some signs of hearing loss? And it's always interesting, again, we deal mostly with children, but I still come across a lot of audiences that, you could talk to 2 spouses and it would be interesting. You'd get 2 very different perspectives on who has the hearing loss and who's doing what. So I'm pretty sure that husbands are convinced that wives mumble and we don't speak clearly. I've actually taken to texting my husband so I can show him later, because he'll be like, you didn't tell me that. And my kids be like, yeah, Dad, she did. So, I'm sure it just has to do with how busy we are or whatever. But, kind of some of those basic things that you might notice, or maybe you may even meet some people who you're like, I'm curious if they're actually hearing me okay. So you might get lots of whats or huhs or repetitions, or maybe, you ask them a question and they're in the ballpark when they answer you, but not exactly. Like they're kind of close in the answer, but not quite. So, that's kind of an idea. Or if there's music or noise happening behind them, sometimes you have more trouble hearing that speech and understanding. For kids, and actually, I saw this for my dad, that kind of social cues or kind of withdrawing, it was just easier to not keep going to family events and things because it was hard to follow the conversations. For folks, sometimes they're accused of daydreaming, or again, could be a spousal thing, that selective hearing. Kids have it too, so if I could fix that, I'd make a lot of money, but it really just has to do with the environment and what's happening. But these are some of those kind of very subtle signs that you might see that would say to you, I wonder if they have a hearing loss or something going on. Educational impact of hearing loss. And again, it's going to depend on when folks come to you. If they've had a hearing loss since a very early age, or if they developed it over time. But even what's considered a mild loss, and we'll cover that a little more, is just a little bit more, difficulty hearing than normal hearing. But for some kids and for some folks, it has a huge impact. And if you think about it, the way schools are set up, it's pretty much an all listening, learning environment. You have some visuals, but the majority of what you're learning is based on listening to the teacher. So, we see it affects speech and language development. Kids have trouble with phonemic awareness, discriminating sounds. Sometimes they don't get grammar, those very soft endings, S's, EDs, INGs, they may not hear that. Sometimes, we've identified kids because the teacher's like, they are so loud. I don't know why they always talk that loud. And sometimes it really is tied to a hearing loss. Or you'll see kids have very concrete, literal thinking. They don't have, they might know that it's pretty, but they wouldn't know that beautiful and glamorous and all those other words kind of mean the same thing. And, there's a great deal of research that there are academic issues, higher stress, self-esteem, social adjustment issues, because they're not always in the know of what's happening. So now we're just going to watch a little video, because I figured that was much more entertaining than me, to just give you an idea of what is the process of hearing. So technology is going to work.
Sound waves entering the ear travel through the external auditory canal before striking the eardrum and causing it to vibrate. The eardrum is connected to the malleus, one of 3 small bones of the middle ear. Also called the hammer, it transmits sound vibrations to the incus, which passes them to the stapes. The stapes pushes in and out against the structure called the oval window. This action is passed on to the cochlea, a fluid-filled, snail-like structure that contains the organ of Corti, the organ for hearing. It consists of tiny hair cells that line the cochlea. These cells translate vibrations into electrical impulses that are carried to the brain by sensory nerves. In this cut view, you can see the organ of Corti with its 4 rows of hair cells. There is an inner row on the left and 3 outer rows on the right. Let's watch this process in action. First, the stapes rocks against the oval window. This transmits waves of sound through the cochlear fluid, sending the organ of Corti into motion. Fibers near the upper end of the cochlea resonate to lower frequency sound. Those near the oval window respond to higher frequencies.
Okay, I love when technology works. That's always a good sign. So just to give you an idea, honestly, I look back, I look at all the resources we can find online now. Grad school would have been so much easier with some of these. When I learned that it was just all flat pictures and the teacher trying to explain it or whatever. So I just so appreciate this, that you can see the movement and see the pieces that look way easier to understand in a video than on a flat picture. So just want to give you a little background on universal newborn hearing screening. This is a national program that has existed because we know with the test protocols that we have is that we can identify if newborns have hearing loss or not. And you know, depending on your perspective and your background, you know, we all know that early intervention, the earlier the better. We also know, and Lori will talk about this a little bit later this morning, is that knowing from day one leads to its own challenges and things for families. You know, so on one hand, good to know, but on the other, you change all of the dynamics of this new birth and this new baby that you have. You know, but really, we can do it. We can find them right away. So really, just like some of the blood testing and things that are done, newborn hearing screening is done for all infants. The goal that the national protocol, EDI, the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Center, has set up is that you have the screening before you leave the hospital that first day. Sometimes, depending where you are, they might re-screen that same day or the next day. But really, they want you to be re-screened because there's a variety of reasons why it may be a pass or a fail or a refer. But they want you to do again within 1 month. And then they also want you to be seen by the audiologist by 3 months so that that hearing loss can be confirmed, and then you can begin that early intervention process by 6 months. So that's kind of the national standard, that 136. So within national numbers, we're seeing about 1.6, so essentially 1 to 2 per 1,000 births. But we also have some Wisconsin statistics here. So the WE track is just the state system for all confirmed hearing losses. All children who are screened kind of feed into that system. But just to give you an idea, in Wisconsin, we're doing a great job. 100% of birthing hospitals are screening children. We also have a great outreach program for home births and midwives. So really, just to see the numbers, 66,000 children, babies were screened in 2015. 1,800 received a refer, so that meant they needed to be re-screened. And of those 1,800, 133 were confirmed to have hearing loss. So if you look at that, it's about that 1 to 1,000, 1.5. I always love statistics because how do you get 1.5 kids? But we know it's somewhere in the middle, depending on the year. So why are we going to assess for hearing loss? What do we want to know? What is it that we're going to look for? Well, depending on the protocol and the audiologist you're seeing, you know, so the assessments that I show you here really are just to kind of give you an idea of which ones involve some response from the folks, which ones can we do just electronically. But really, with all of them, usually it's some combination of the assessments or the test protocols. What we're trying to find out is what's the threshold, what's that lowest level that the person can hear. Threshold is kind of a 50% mark, so if it's a little louder, you hear it every time. If it's a little quieter, you might not hear it. So we're looking for that, pretty sure I hear it kind of level. We're going to look at the frequencies. Do you have a hearing loss in the low pitches, in the mid pitches, or the high pitches? And then we can graph that. We know where speech sounds line up and what that looks like, and I'll show you those here in a few minutes. And the reason we do that is because we want to take, I just saw a recent thing, one of the speakers we might have for one of our conferences talks about hearing losses like zebras. Every zebra has its unique stripes. So if you've met one person with hearing loss, you've met one person with hearing loss, because it all depends on when did their hearing loss begin, what are their life experiences, what kinds of interventions have they had. So even if I had exactly the same audiogram, same numbers for somebody, their outcomes and experiences could be very, very different. So I kind of liked that zebra analogy, that it's different for each person that we meet. But we want to know, can we give them better auditory access through some type of amplification? Can they benefit from some kind of assistive listening device or other technology? And really, do we need to look at communication modes? Will they use listening and spoken language? Will they use American Sign Language? Will they use some mix of all of the above? It's just really trying to get those tools and resources to families as quickly as we can. So I mentioned this briefly. So this is a picture audiogram. And really, if you ever have a hearing evaluation in clinic, you will never, ever see this picture again. But the reason I like this one is because, first of all, especially for new families being identified, it's a whole lot of information to take in. You're talking pitch and hertz and decibels and all these scientific terms. And they're just saying, I just want to know what my baby can hear. So this is kind of a mix of the two worlds. So across the top is the frequencies from low pitches at 125 or 250 hertz to high frequencies, 8,000 hertz. Down the left side is the hearing level or the decibel level from 0, which is referenced to normal, so you could get into logarithms and all kinds of discussion about this, but really 0 to 20 is considered normal, and then it gets louder as you go down the scale. And the pictures kind of reflect that. You have, whispering and birds chirping at the very high end, at the top end of the graph, and at the bottom you have things like rock bands and jackhammers and aircraft. So based on the testing, we can plot out on this audiogram where is their hearing loss. Is it in the low pitches? Does it slope? Is it flat? Which just gives us information about interventions and what kind of access they might have to speech and those kinds of things. Again, we're not going to go through all those pieces today, but just to kind of set the stage for you, what are we looking for? So kind of quickly go through some testing methods here to just kind of give you an idea of how do we make that graph? How do we come up with this information? So air conduction is the testing that almost probably, how many of you had a hearing screening when you were in school? Okay. How many of you have had a hearing evaluation from an audiologist? Okay, we're about a quarter of folks. So you should be familiar with this process. It really is, we put the earphones on, or you might have had insert earphones, which look kind of like hearing protection. They're the little foam earplugs, and then they can actually put them in, so you don't have to have the headset over your head. But really what it's doing is it's evaluating the whole system, from your outer ear, through your middle ear, through your eardrum, all those steps that we saw in that video, which is amazing because it happens instantaneously. When you think about that, there's all the steps to that process. It's amazing that we don't have more issues somewhere along the steps to the process because it's instantaneous. You know if you're watching an old movie and the voice doesn't quite match up with the lip movements, that bad dubbing kind of thing. That's an electronic thing, not a hearing thing. So that's what's happening when you see that in the movies. But really what we're looking for is we can test all of those different frequencies, and then we can figure out how loud does it need to be for that person to hear. So for this one, how many of you, this is bone conduction testing, which is part of the assessment. If you're at the audiologist, probably had it done. It gives us information on if we don't go through the outer ear and the eardrum and the bones, do you hear the same? With this testing, with that bone conduction vibrator behind your ear, it lets us figure out how does the nerve respond without going through all the spots. So of those of you who've had your hearing tested, how many of you had this part, the bone conduction testing? Okay, we're down to like 2, whereas before we had 10 or 15. So again, depending on if your hearing was normal, they probably didn't go any further. If they needed to get some more information, then they would have added this piece. So again, this just helps us figure out what kind of hearing loss. Is it the same regardless of how we go in? Tympanometry is not a hearing test. It just gives us more information about how the middle ear system is working. So for kids who have lots of ear infections, they've probably had this test done a lot. It can tell me if there's a hole in the eardrum. It can tell me if the eardrum is stiff or if it's moving the way we expect it to be. If it gives me a different kind of shape, it can tell me that maybe those middle ear bones aren't even connected. And those are things I can't see from the outside with an otoscope or those kinds of things. So this kind of testing just gives us some of that additional information. But for any of those, the headphones or the bone conduction, we can't do those on babies. They're too little. They can't raise their hand. They're not going to be able to do that kind of testing. They can't let us know. They can't respond behaviorally. So then what? How do we test those 2-hour-old babies or 12-hour-old babies? Well, one of the protocols that they use is called otoacoustic emissions. And some of these, I always, somebody had to stumble upon these, so it always kind of amazes me. With this one, what happens is it's really just a little ear tip like you see, and then the machine makes a sound, which it puts through the hearing system, goes through the eardrum, out into the hair cells, and then our ears actually, if everything is working correctly, reflect back a sound. And this otoacoustic emissions equipment is what measures that reflected sound that comes back out through the system. And if you have a hearing loss, then this doesn't happen. So really the fact that somebody knew they were measuring something in the ear and they're like, hey, what is that weird artifact? And then they figured out that they could use this measure to really, so either for the babies or for when you have patients or students or children or adults that can't respond. Maybe their physical limitations do not let them give you a response to tell you that they heard something. This is one way that you can measure to see, is the beginning part of the system working okay? So then the other thing, yes?
Do you prefer questions now or after?
I prefer as we go, otherwise we'll all forget.
Do you feel it's needed for young babies to have testing? I mean, I imagine with, maybe babies are pretty scarred from that experience. So you want to add like a test on top of that after the traumatic experience of being born and going through the birth canal?
That's a very excellent question. So his question is related to, they've gone through enough just arriving in the world kind of thing. So do we want to test them right away? And I think, babies go through several tests. So I think it's really been kind of through a process that they've come to this. What used to happen in the old days is we didn't identify kids till they were 2 or 3, when they were not talking, were not developing speech and language the same as their peers. So that left us 2 or 3 years where they've had no auditory or minimal auditory access, no intervention, no supports. And I think the reason, that it's put into that piece of newborn hearing screening in the hospital is because once the family leaves the hospital, there's a whole nother layer of loss to follow-up, getting them back. Not everybody has equal access to health care. So yes, I appreciate that we add some layers, to that experience, but through research and things, they found that's the one place that we for sure have access to all those babies. Did I answer your question? Okay. You have another question?
Well, I have 2 questions. And the first one was, what kind of reaction are you looking for from the type with the little thing in its ear, the autoacoustic thing?
Otoacoustic emissions. Mm-hmm. Do you want to ask the second question? Is it related or totally separate?
What kind of reaction are you looking for? How do you know if they're hearing or?
So for both this one, for OAE, and the one that we'll talk about next, auditory brainstem response, electronic. The system measures it and actually just tells you pass or refer. It's all statistical and they have bodies and bodies of research. So for this kind of testing, OAEs or ABR, no response needed, whether you're a child or an adult. It's all electronic.
Okay, I see. And then second question was that from my thought, if they're doing this as an infant, early intervention, does that come into play? Like the earlier it's detected, the sooner you can address it?
Yes. So exactly. So whether it's autism or hearing loss or vision loss, the earlier we know, the earlier we can support. So that's kind of because hearing loss is a little bit different because it's a sensory system. We just know that the longer it takes to identify it, the further behind the child is going to be. So if we can get hearing aids and get them support right away, many of those kids, the research we're seeing, they develop exactly the same on par, on time with their peers. Whereas before, when we couldn't identify it until they were 2 or 3 years old, they're already 2 or 3 years behind by the time we are even able to start supporting. So that's why the push is to get it as early as possible. So this is another one. So you see, the baby's asleep. The the kind of standard terminology now is auditory brainstem response, ABR. If you're looking at old information or old reports, you may see some of these other, it was brainstem electroacoustic response or BARE. There's all these other acronyms, but today's standard, that it's been that way probably for about 15, 20 years now, is ABR. But really what we're going to do is you put the electrodes on, the earphones in. So this baby actually has insert earphones. Those are those little tiny foam insert earphones. And we're going to present some clicks or some tone bursts, and we're going to actually measure electronically the brain's response to those sounds. So for this one, same thing. Baby doesn't need to do anything. Actually better if they're sleeping. And then we can get some information about the hearing loss, what frequencies. This primarily works best for high frequencies, but it does give us some information, and you can do some gross levels like 40 dB or 50 dB. We can't get within 5, but it gives you kind of a range.
Do all or most insurances cover these types of testing, or all these types of testing?
Usually. So again, I'm glad I don't have to dabble in the world of insurance anymore. So for most folks, because this is a diagnostic or we suspect something, most of the ABR, OAE, hearing evaluation testing is covered. There is legislation in Wisconsin that all children should be provided with hearing aids and the necessary services and supports to do that. But what we found is that there was a big loophole written into it. So if the company is considered self-insured, so even large companies like a Walmart could be considered self-insured because they write their own policy, then it's not required. So really, we see about 25 to 50% of kids are getting all of the services, all of the testing, all of the things they need. No questions asked, insurance pays for it. But there are still many instances where, say, you need hearing aids or you need a cochlear implant or some of these other things that families still need to kind of go through that appeal request process. So not 100%. So this is one, this is another one. So this is a third option, just a little bit different kind of approach to the process. This one's an electrophysiological response to rapid auditory stimuli. What this one does is, of the three, OAE just kind of tells us a pass-fail and are those outer hair cells working. The ABR can give us some more information, but can't get to like within 5 dB. You're reading a wave form response and doing some interpretation. Auditory steady state is a little more cut and dried. Actually gives us a somewhat statistical estimate of hearing levels depending on the body's response to the sound, but only the very biggest centers like Children's or American Family in Madison have this kind of auditory steady state response technology. So again, if you want to read a little bit more about it, that's what the references are for. So we do a lot with electronics and physiological measures and those kinds of things that don't require a response. Really good for the babies or little kids who can't respond to us, can't speak back to us. We don't get any information. But what about the adults? I've already told you that I can take the same 2 hearing losses and have very different outcomes or needs for that person. So we also do some speech measures to kind of try and figure out how much distortion is part of the system. So we can do something just very gross for the little babies. When they get to even 6 months, 1 year old, they could be in a more traditional format where they're in a sound test booth and you can present sound to them and see how they respond. So a speech detection or an awareness threshold is just really the audiologist is saying things like, Laura, look over here. You're just making sound, seeing if the baby does anything at certain levels. So really, that's all it is, very gross. Like what level, what decibel level do they respond to speech? Then you can do a speech reception threshold, which gives you a little bit more information. It kind of can tell you if it matches up with where you're getting those thresholds for the different frequencies. But again, they use words like hot dog, baseball, just to see can the person repeat them back, or for little kids you can use a picture pointing task. It's just kind of trying to give you kind of like reassurance that those electronic measures that you did are really kind of what you're seeing functionally or kind of more real-time, real life for folks. And really, the one that we really rely on is kind of a word recognition or discrimination score. It really is just a list of words, usually 25 or 50 words. You know, depending upon, there's different lists you can use, but they're really kind of balanced for all the speech sounds. So then you can take a look at, like, if it's the word first or bread or whatever, are they missing parts of it? What sounds are they? It's a percent score. So if you miss 20 out of 25 words, you really only have about a 20% discrimination score, which means it doesn't matter how loud I make it, your system's still not going to let you hear those sounds. So that's, again, where you could have the same audiogram, same threshold, same picture, but one person might have 100% speech discrimination. They get it all, they can hear it all, and the other person, because of their hair cell damage and whatever's in their system, might have a 20% discrimination score. So again, no matter how loud we make it, still not going to sound very good. Okay. So now we're going to go through a couple types of hearing loss, just to kind of give you an idea of what kinds of different situations might folks come in with. And we'll just go through all of these, so I'm not going to read them now. So if a person has what we consider a conductive hearing loss, what's that mean? Well, really, if you've ever had to wear ear protection for working in your yard or at a job or whatever, you essentially have given yourself a conductive hearing loss. You have put an earplug in to keep the sound from going through. So that can happen exactly from hearing protection. If you get wax that actually plugs off your ear, you can end up with a conductive hearing loss. For kids, if they have a lot of middle ear fluid or that fluid becomes thick and infected, they can end up with a conductive hearing loss. So whatever the cause, whether hole in your eardrum, the middle ear bones aren't there, or they're disconnected, a conductive hearing loss is just something's keeping the sound from going through. And that has a maximum of about 60 dB. And for most folks, it can either be corrected or, you know, for ear infections, you might have antibiotics, which clears up that infection. If you have a hole in your eardrum, that can be repaired surgically. So usually, in most situations, can be addressed medically. But what will the majority of people who come through your door have? What kind of hearing loss will they have? That would, in most instances, will be a sensorineural hearing loss. Tends to be permanent. It does not, if you have a sensorineural hearing loss, only in certain circumstances is there a possibility for improvement. Once the hair cells are damaged and gone, there's no bringing them back. There's no medical treatment. There's no medication. There's research in those areas about hair cell regeneration and things like that. We're not there now. So once you have a sensorineural hearing loss, it's probably what you're going to have either from here on out or potentially could get worse. On that audiogram, and we'll go through the levels, it can be mild from 15, 25 dB all the way down to 120. You can have a hearing loss that would prevent you from hearing jet engines. You can have anywhere along that range. What people who have a sensorineural hearing loss usually report is, one, things are softer, kind of like a conductive hearing loss. You're just not hearing them as loudly, and they may be distorted. So that's where, depending upon your specific hair cell damage, where your issue is in the system, that's where you may also have that distortion piece. And for many folks, a hearing aid or cochlear implant or other kinds of technology can help improve that access to sound. But again, if you have a lot of distortion in your system, we have no way right now to correct that distortion piece. So these aren't really types of hearing loss. I just wanted you to be aware of some of these kind of other features or things that could happen with a hearing loss. So whether it was conductive or sensorineural, it can be fluctuating. It can go up and down. Depending upon what's causing it, you could have very different good days and bad days. If kids have ear infections, they could have 3 months, 6 months where their hearing is decreased because of that fluid, and then when it resolves, then their hearing returns to within normal limits. So it can fluctuate over time. The problem is that most people don't know. Just like when you get glasses for the first time, you're like, wow, that's what it's supposed to look like, because your brain just kind of adjusts to it. So if you get used to hearing it at a different level, it's not like you suddenly are like, oh, that doesn't sound the same. It's really not usually very obvious to folks, you know. But some kids have met some kids, they can they can tell you the day that ear infection is starting. They are just so sensitive to the information they receive auditorily that they can be pretty quick to let you know when something's going on. And again, if it's happening for 3 months or 6 months or even a week, think about a child's day in a week at school. If they were hearing half of the information, how much information have they missed in that week? So in Wisconsin, this can be an academically significant hearing loss. You can also have a progressive hearing loss. For many of our adults, for most people who have presbycusis or that kind of aging-related hearing loss, it's usually progressive over time. And we will all probably lose some over time just because it's a blood flow, the hair cells, all of those things, the environmental things we've been exposed to, the noise levels we've been exposed to. The progressive loss could also fluctuate. It could be sudden or gradual, and we'll cover a couple conditions where it can be sudden, like you have hearing today and tomorrow you have none. Same as kind of maybe with an accident or a car accident. Again, sometimes you're not aware because you think everybody else is, my wife mumbles, she doesn't talk as clearly, or she talks to me from the kitchen, or all those kinds of things. They're all kind of early indicators of something could be changing. And then noise-induced hearing loss, you know, we know it happens for adults, particularly those that work in industry, but we're seeing a significant increase for it for teenagers. And why is that happening? Well, for noise-induced hearing loss, it can be a one-time thing, like you are in the area of an explosion, a rifle shot, something like that. You could have a permanent hearing loss from that one single, very loud exposure. It can also happen over time. You know, if you work industrially, there's all kinds of OSHA regulations. If you are exposed to 85 dB of noise or more for an 8-hour period, your place of business has to provide you with ear protection, because they know once you're at that 90 dB for 4 hours or more in a day, you're gradually changing those hair cells and those structures. You know, the best way that I always know, and I'm guilty, I'm an audiologist, but I like my music and I like it loud, is you leave the concert, and I've had it happen at the symphony, so it's not just a rock concert kind of thing, but you know, they're playing it so you have that whole body music experience, and when you leave and you're in the parking lot, you're like, your ears are ringing, you just feel kind of full. People are nodding, obviously it's not just me. But you know, so you've left, you've got that little bit of ringing, sometimes your ears actually feel full, like you're like, it feels like something's in there, but there's not. That's your very first sign that like, uh-oh, you were a little too loud and I'm unhappy now. You know, for most of us, that just resolves and the hair cells settle down and they become happy again. But if you're a musician and you're doing that every weekend, that's why you see all the musicians with earplugs in now. They are actually tied right into the soundboard, so they've got ear protection and they hear the music not coming through the speakers. So that's why you see them all with their fancy ear molds. That's the job I want. I want to make ear molds for rock stars, but obviously I missed that boat. But anyways, just some ideas of noise exposure and in everything you do every day. In your car, even if you don't have your radio on, your car makes noise. That's noise exposure. You know, depending upon your work, it could be construction equipment. You know, that's why you see the guys on the tarmac at the airport with earmuffs. That sound out there is really, really loud. Recreational, hunting, music, everything plugs into your ears now. And that's the reason that we're seeing that increase for teenagers. It's rare that you don't see a kid with at least one earplug in or two, and they don't naturally come with output limiters. You can download it from Apple. You can get a thing to like set the limit, but none of those things come with regulations to do that. So you figure you're listening to music all day, you might be at a level louder than OSHA requires you to have hearing protection. So, you know, and even, you know, just taking care of things around the house, you can get noise exposure. So some folks who you might see come in with what's called a unilateral hearing loss. They might have normal hearing in one ear and some amount of hearing in another. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm still...
Go back. Mm-hmm.
Headphones and the noise exposure.
Uh-huh.
Do the bone conduction headphones limit or bypass altogether the possibility of ear damage?
Conduction headphones.
Instead of going in the ear, they just go over the bone?
Okay, so and so my probably questioning look to you is I have not seen earphones that actually vibrate your skull in the same. You do? Okay. So see, this is why we all learn, right? It's all about learning from each other. So, some of the earphones that kids wear do go over their ears, but it's still putting the sound into their ears. So, interesting. All right. No, I would love to see them when we're done at the break. I have not seen those, so I will be researching that. And I don't know because I don't know about them. My guess is that because of the structures and how much power it takes to actually vibrate your skull to make the sound happen and be noticed in your ears, is that the system, that process probably automatically limits you from getting to a certain level. But I don't know. That's my gut just knowing the system, but because you probably can't turn it up to 130 dB. You know what I mean? Because you actually have to, I would love to listen to it. I'm curious like what the sound sounds like and that kind of thing. You just have to do more to make those inner ear structures move through bone conduction. But again, I've not seen anything, so we will continue with that. So I've got one question here, and then we'll come up here.
First statement and then also a question.
Okay.
One thing that I've noticed just anecdotally is that people in general, when they have better quality headphones or sound systems, they end up turning it lower than poor quality ones. It seems like it's habitual, maybe psychological. People when they think that it's low quality to turn it the volume up.
If you turn it up, it'll be clearer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually isn't.
Right. You're just making it more distorted.
Yeah. And I mean, if you get obviously more expensive, let's say headphones, you get noise canceling, noise isolating, and you tend to turn those ones down. The question I had was, has there been a trend in electronic devices in terms of their total volume? Like, have they been getting louder, or have the settings been getting louder as time progresses?
And I don't know the research behind that. I don't know that. I just know, like, from some of the things I've seen through audiology journals is that, even old Walkmans or whatever, because we're audiologists, we measure them, like how much is coming out of there. You know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of, the limit is really around 125, 130 dB. So it's not that they can't turn it down. Somebody actually told me they got Hello Kitty earphones from like the dollar store that had an output limiter in the headphones, like that they had seen those. I've not found them, but you know what I mean? So you have to be aware that it's too loud. And I mean, again, if your market is 13 to 18-year-olds, they're never going to go to the package that says, hey, we're going to turn it down for you. And so that's where Apple kind of put it in after the fact, that you could add this app or feature or whatever it is when you add it, that you could set that max. But they all have pretty consistently been around that 130 dB. Laura?
In Apple settings, you can set a restriction in volume level without adding an
Okay.
app.
Yeah, so they've obviously made it easier for people to access because it's been requested enough that you can just change it for yourself, but you got to know that you'd want to change it in the first place. So, and then there's a question here.
I was just curious. My husband is deaf. Our children are hearing. But now my son is in his 30s, and we're noticing, and he's telling us he doesn't hear as well anymore, and he's listening to the TV too loud, and most importantly, he's talking too loud. If there was some relationship between my husband's deafness and him, something in the history there, wouldn't that have been discovered earlier on?
So one question before I answer, was your husband deaf from birth or progressive as well?
From birth.
The hardest thing about genetics, I think, is that most insurances don't cover that testing. So I think that we could have a lot more information than we do. You know what I mean? So it could be that maybe because your husband is deaf and you were hearing, it's a recessive kind of thing, a progressive, like related but different, or a mutation or a variance. I would say get your son to go in and get a test and get it, find a baseline and get monitored.
It reminded me, my son has leukemia when he was 4 years old, so he was treated and he had a reaction to something. So on,
Could
those
be.
kind of things cause?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, and again with the body, I would not put a deadline on that. If you've had some kind of illness or something that required certain medication treatment, that within a year you're going to know if you have a hearing loss. So that would be an excellent question for his doctor. It's probably going to end up in one of those. We can't answer that with 100% certainty. You've already labeled a couple possibilities, but they still haven't gotten, there's connexin 26 is the main gene that they find for hearing loss, but again, there's so many variations and so many pieces that we don't know yet. And again, we meet families who want to have genetic testing because their child's the first ever. And then the insurance is like, well, yeah, if you want to pay $5,000, we don't cover that. It's not a naturally covered kind of thing. So maybe someday we'll get there and we'll have more info. Let's see, did we cover? For folks, so that's where, kind of that zebra analogy, or if you've met one person with a hearing loss, you've met one person with a hearing loss. Because some people who could have normal hearing and no usable hearing, they used to use the term dead ear. I don't like that at all. I don't, you just have no usable hearing on that other side, are fine. Like they make it through life, all of their academic and their career decisions, and you never ever know unless they told you. And for other kids, they can't separate the noise, they can't tell which way it's coming from. You put them in a classroom with 25 kids and the world falls apart. But often the first thing, oh, they've got one good ear, they're going to be fine, is sometimes what the pediatrician will tell the family. And from our experience as educators, that's a big maybe. So again, it's just helping families know what might the possibilities be, what kinds of things can be watching for, what kinds of supports might help. Sometimes it's just seating, like that the kid sits on the outside of the classroom with his good ear to the whole class. Sometimes you're alphabetical, so you're on the other side so that your poor ear is to the class. Sometimes that little fix can take care of that, those kinds of things. So the next two things we're going to talk about aren't new kinds of hearing loss. I think, like many things, we just get better at identifying or learning them, or you kind of go through your protocol and then you're like, oh, this doesn't match anything we know. Where does this come from? And so this next area that we're going to talk about, auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, is one of those things. I think it's always been there. I just think we didn't know how to look for it. We didn't know how to evaluate it. So I'll tell you a little bit about what happens, and then I'll tell you kind of how we came to that learning. How did, kind of like bone conduction hearing aids, until we have a conversation about it, or somebody looks at it, maybe you don't know. But for auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, what happens is it's those inner hair cells, or the hair cells themselves, don't always tell the nerve what it's really listening to. So what adults, or with folks who have usable hearing and can describe it, what they talk about is kind of like the radio not being tuned in. Like you might want 93.1, but if you as you're scanning through, but you pick it up at 93.3, you can hear it, you get the gist of it, depending upon if you're on a hill or in a valley, you know what I mean? Like you can get most of the information, just not clear. But when you get to 93.1, then it's clear. And so folks with auditory neuropathy who have usable hearing will say they have good days and bad days. Some of them will even describe it as like changing with the weather. And so you talk about what feels like non-science. It really has to do with how well is that nerve hearing the information and firing correctly. So it's just not synchronous. So like the word mom could be different every time you hear it because the nerve just does its own thing. It's not doing what you expect. Where we started to kind of find this, and so you could have an audiogram, so people with auditory neuropathy may have completely normal hearing. They hear all the tones at 0 dB, they respond all the time. But then you ask them a question and they can't hear, or when we test their hearing, I can tell you their threshold is at 0, but they can't talk. You're like, what's up? What is that? That shouldn't happen. And so the way we found it was kind of the opposite way. There were two different ways that we were finding it. Is that with newborn hearing screening and being able to test infants very young, that ABR part, or that otoacoustic emissions, should have a certain pattern if you do multiple things. So the children would get an ABR that said refer. They'd go through all the steps, go to the audiologist, have their ABR, and they're like, there's no waveform. They're deaf. They have no usable hearing. Yet the child starts to develop speech and language. And you're like, okay, what's with this? Because based on what we measure physiologically, this should not be possible. And so, there would be families saying, like, she responds to me, she answers me, and I'm sure, many audiologists are going, yeah, right, wishful thinking, whatever. So, okay, so that was one way. Like, we were getting mismatch of what we could measure electronically and what was functionally happening for children. The other is because, when you're a researcher, and you're teaching grad students, you have to have them do all these tests. You have to do ABR and otoacoustic emissions and pure tone and bone connect. You do everything, all of those things. You don't select because you're not under insurance constraints. We're going to do them all. So then they started doing the testing, and they found out, like, we had these normal grad students come in to participate in a research study, and they had no ABR. Well, they're functioning, they're college students, like, how can that happen? So then they went to many schools for the deaf and worked with testing deaf adults, and they found out for some of these folks who normally shouldn't have otoacoustic emissions or have no ABR, because before, when we only could do the hand raising, they were labeled as deaf, like they had no usable hearing. But they had an ABR. Well, if you have, you know what I mean? Like, so that's where they kind of came up with it. And then as more cases and more findings and more people were looking for it, that's where they came to find out that it's really this neural synchronous issue. So you see people, if you talk about hearing loss, meeting one person, auditory neuropathy, all across the board. And it's newer because we've just really in the last 10 years been consistently researching this. So were there any hands? Okay. So another one that we've kind of found, this isn't a hearing, it's not a type of hearing loss. It's a condition which can predispose you to the potential for sudden or progressive hearing loss. And I'm going to show you the picture first, and then I'll come back. So what we're talking about, an enlarged vestibular aqueduct syndrome, as you can see on the top one, the endolymphatic sac is a certain size, and then that duct that connects it to the semicircular canals, that's the part that manages your balance that people have. When you have EVAS, what happens is this area here is too large. And again, with imaging studies, you can measure it. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we would know people had progressive hearing loss, but we didn't have the easy MRI imaging, CT scans technology that we have now. So people would come in, had a sudden hearing loss, you had a sudden hearing loss. We never looked any further. It's just, what are we going to do to manage it now? Well, as imaging techniques became more efficient and more cost effective, they were able to see that you should have a certain width on that little duct. And if it's wider, what can happen is normally the fluid only flows one way in that system, but with that wider duct, you can have like barometric pressure going down in an airplane or a fall where it can cause that fluid to go the wrong way. And then you end up, it pushes it back through the wrong way, through the cochlea, and now you've bent the hair cells the wrong way. So now you can have a sudden hearing loss. And so really that's where, like stories that started with kids was like, well, they fell off their bike, but they didn't really bump their head very hard, or they had their helmet on, or, little everyday things that you wouldn't normally think should result in a hearing loss. And then they started monitoring that and kind of, again, putting those pieces together as they saw more and more folks with this. Or that same thing, like I had a really bad cold and I could hear, and I woke up and I couldn't hear. That's a pressure change or a system change or those kinds of things. So, and another one, meet one, you haven't met two, because it's always different.
Is that one also fluctuating, or sort of once that flow goes the wrong way, the hearing loss is
This is one of the rarer ones where it can be fluctuating. So what we've seen, so like, say you've had a big drop, and again, so normally in hearing loss, it tends to be very gradual, 5, 10 dB. So say you had a 30 dB hearing loss, and the next time you go for your test, you have a 60 dB hearing loss. It's like, oh, what the heck? Like, why is that happening? So then they kind of, then now the protocol is, before you'd be like, oh, well, you dropped 30 dB, come back in 6 months or a year, we'll see if you drop again. Well, now the protocol is, let's do an MRI or a CT scan and see, do we know this exists? Because if this exists, And again, sometimes some knowledge or more knowledge can be a good thing, and sometimes it can't. Sometimes what we saw for families is you now need to decide, am I going to let my son be a football player? Am I going to let my daughter be a volleyball player on the chance she's going to take a conk on the head? And there's no answer. So the initial one, probably 15, 20 years ago, was like, well, let's put a helmet on them. We're going to protect them if they fall. Well, they found the helmets don't, you know what I mean? Because whether you have the helmet on or not, you're not protecting the structures. It's fluid. It's going to move whether you have a helmet on or not. So sometimes you see for folks, they'll be like, oh, it seems like I'm down today, but then I'll get better. And maybe they have these gradual up and downs, and then poof, then they go off. So again, there's no crystal ball for this one, so it can be any of those things. Do we go to 10:15 or 10:45? All right, we're moving right along, just right. Sometimes I get sidetracked, so then I've learned if I have 90 minutes, I have like 35 slides. Anyways, now we're going to talk a little bit about hearing levels. What are the differences? What does it mean? What does it look like? So again, you can see this is our audiogram. So we went from the one with the pictures to now this one has just got the frequencies from low to high and the decibel levels from soft or 0 to 120, getting louder. I put the terms on here, and in a minute you'll see I don't use the terms because when you say unilateral or you say mild, or even if I say profound, all of us have our own experiences and beliefs and connections to those words. Sometimes for many people, mild or unilateral means no problem. And that may or may not be true. So again, I use the words because if you're reading about things or looking things up, this is most likely how you're going to see it. But I'll give you the numbers and then kind of what happens for folks. So before we do that, though, we're going to do a little bit of a sound demonstration. And again, you have to remember that this is a recording. It's an electronic, so really the takeaway is just to kind of get a feel of how it's different, okay? With a normal loss or moderate loss, and then both of those things. Yes?
The captionist can't hear anymore.
Oh, thanks for letting us know. We will double check that. So I'm just going to keep talking. I'm going to keep vamping.
I was removed from my own meeting. I don't know.
Maybe a time limit. See, as long as my technology works, we can fix the others. We'll get there. Same thing. You have to love the capability to do remote captioning, but again, it's only as good as the technology and how well the person on the other side can hear. So we will just take a 30-second pause.
Are you saying it's yes? Yes.
Oh, there he is. Okay, we got the captioner back.
Okay, we'll just give folks a second to settle back in. Captionist is back into the meeting room, so.
Should be. Oh.
Are we good? Do it. I can't see if our captioning is working. All right, we're just going to take a second and do a captioning test here.
Okay, we're back. Sorry, everybody.
Okay, excellent. All right, we all needed a stretch anyways. Okay, so we're just going to go forward here and do our actual, I'm just going to play these 4 little short snippets for you. And I will say, I'm going to own this. When I first clicked on this, I thought he was giving me information, that it was not just the audio clip, that I needed to be paying attention for the next thing. So it's really just to hear it. But
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing protection whenever you're around loud sounds. Loud noise causes permanent hearing loss. A high-frequency hearing loss makes it difficult to understand conversations. A hearing test or audiogram helps find any unusual changes in your hearing. Off-the-job noise is just as dangerous as noise on the job. The loudness of noise is measured in decibels.
Okay, so again, just if you want to know about noise levels and decibels, that's what it's about. So now I will play what it sounds like, again, electronic reproduction of a moderate hearing loss.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing protection whenever you're around loud sounds.
So what do you notice? It's muffled. What else? It's quieter. So again, kind of what we described. So that's kind of a reenactment of a sensorineural hearing loss. So here's normal hearing with just noise in the background.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing.
Okay. What do you notice? Static. Anything else? It's hard to hear. So really one of the biggest things that we face in schools is not that the child can't hear well, it's noise. When you put 25 kids in a room, you're never not going to have noise. You know, even if it's just kids moving and paper shuffling and body noise and somebody's coughing and somebody sneezed and all that kind of stuff. So really for school academic functions, the biggest thing that we're facing is that noise piece, because even with normal hearing, it can be challenging. So now we're going to add the hearing loss to it, and we'll see what you think.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing protection whenever you're around loud sounds.
And I apologize, it's not captioned. It's more for the feeling of the sensation that it's there. But what happens then with that noise is you pick out certain words. You could hear earmuffs and hearing protection, but all that stuff in between, you're like, I know they're talking, but you can't figure it out. So that's kind of, again, you could have the exact same audiogram. One person's going to be more affected by the noise and their own distortion.
Why could I hear that better?
Why could you hear that better? Because we are going to do a study on you. I cannot answer that question. I don't, which one, I guess I should.
The last one you heard better? Yeah, I can hear the words.
The noise?
The first one was so much static and so much noise. The second one, you can hear the words.
And part of that might be tied to the selective hearing part. Because, just because you're male. No, it really, what it is that you knew it was going to be challenging, so you automatically focused more energy and effort. You know what I mean? To hear it, because you're like, oh, this is going to be hard, so I'm really going to pay attention. And so you can think about that too. That's great for my 30-second clip, but now you put it in a 7-hour school day, and you can imagine why kids are exhausted, maybe misbehaving at the end of the day. Maybe why your spouse doesn't want to talk to you when they get home, because maybe if they have a little bit of hearing loss, they've been working so hard through the day. Like, the kids tell us, I just want it off. I just want it quiet. And I can so appreciate having that kind of, we talk about kind of a superpower. You can do that. I can't. Like, that's kind of cool. So.
I just have a quick theory. I've seen this in certain circumstances, so this is a bit anecdotal, but the brain can kind of train itself to filter certain sounds better than others. So let's say you're used to listening to lo-fi AM radio, which that second one kind of sounded like. Your brain is more used to filtering out the sounds that you're not supposed to hear versus the first one. Your brain may not be as trained to filtering out the sounds that you need to.
And actually, it's tied to kind of a physiological reaction to that, because they call it a cocktail party effect. When you're in a party, you normally talk louder because you're trying to overcome, or you can focus on that, but there's all these other conversations. So it kind of just depends on your environment, your practice, your learning, your experiences, where maybe it can work a little bit better for you. So now we're going to kind of take that picture with all the colors, the normal, mild, moderate, and talk a little bit more about what are the characteristics or possibly challenges that someone with that kind of hearing loss or level of hearing loss is really kind of like how we best describe it. Because we want family, and again, because I've always got my kid hat on, but I'm sure for adults too, like, I think there's comfort in knowing where might I struggle, because then you can at least work on strategies and being more prepared for, when you get in those situations. So I did not put this in here, but if you want more information about each of the levels of hearing loss, this resource, successforchildrenwithhearingloss.com, has a section on relationship of hearing loss to listening and learning. So again, you're like, I'm going to have mostly adults come into my office and talk to me. It just kind of gives you an idea of what the different, she's got them all broken down by the numbers, what might some of the social and interactional challenges kind of be. So I got a question here and then up here.
Well, the question I have is, when you have the hearing test and you're in a hearing seat and it's really quiet and you're purposely focusing to hear a noise, I question, like, how accurate is that in a normal setting for someone who has hearing loss or, I guess, hearing? Because when I had my hearing tested in the thousands, I'm focusing so much to try and hear a noise. But when I'm out at work or I'm wherever, I hear noise and people talking, but unless I truly focus and they say, Angie, I'm not hearing it. I'm not hearing the words, I guess. I hear noise, but not the words.
Yeah, so kind of twofold, because you're right, because you've taken a clinical environment and you know your purpose of being there, so you want it to be the best that it can be. And so really, again, we do things a little bit differently in the schools, is we kind of refer to that as the functional hearing. I can test you in the booth, I can get my numbers, but so then what? What does that mean for the environment and the things that I'm in? And I didn't put it in here because we primarily do it. When we talked about the speech measures, that word recognition, audiologists could do that percent correct, that word recognition in quiet and noise to kind of get a feel for, like, how do you do differently when it's quiet and focused and noise? And again, because you're in the clinic and very specific purpose, to me, every number is kind of a grain of salt, because you're right, depending on the environments, where you go, what's happening, you're tired that day, it could be different. But kind of looking at that ability in quiet and noise can give you is there a difference? For some people, there's no difference. For some people, they can do 100% in quiet and they drop to 50, 40% in noise. Like noise just, because their system can't sort the noise from the speech, and that's probably what you're experiencing. In the schools, what we often do is actually called a functional listening assessment, where they're listening to sentences or paragraphs, and we set them at a distance. So I can test them up close. I can test them at the back of the room. So I can know if that distance interferes with things. I can manipulate the noise and find out if it's this amount of noise, they do this, and if it's playground noise, they do that. The thing, though, that we see is clinically is that every one of those tests that they add is tied to an insurance code and a So they probably would just do more anecdotal things and find out, like, where are you struggling? Do you have hearing aids? Are you having trouble in noise? We can adjust that more so than measure it. But we can measure it in some ways. And then there was another question up here.
Just out of curiosity, why a lowercase d and a capital B?
For decibel?
Yeah.
Because actually the person who was Bell is tied to BEL, so it has to do with the measurement, just like Hertz, HZ, or those kind of abbreviations or definitions. So it's not, the B is not a capital B in the same sense of, or like sometimes if you see literature about deafness or deaf, you might have little d, big D, which is a cultural thing. This truly is that's how they anecdote, or instead of writing out decibel, it's tied to the logarithms and la la la. Wow, that one I've never had. I had to reach way back to undergrad for that one. Okay, so we're just kind of go through this, but again, so this is the same thing. I can take two people with their hearing loss and then 26 to 40 dB loss, and as she kind of described, it could be very different. So we'll just talk a little bit about what might be happening for these folks. What might you see with these kinds of levels of loss? And I'm guessing in your situation, it might be more of that anecdotal. They're going to come to you guys and be like, I just can't hear the TV so good, or, you know, I need to hear my wife better, those kinds of things. Has anybody ever brought any of you guys an audiogram and been like, hey, here's my audiogram, can we talk?
Has any husband ever said that?
My favorite stories are when like one spouse thinks the other one isn't hearing so well, and so the agreement is we're both going to go get our hearing tested, and it's the other one who has the hearing loss. I love those stories. So anyways, but yeah, so, okay, where were we going? So if the adults come to you again, they're probably not going to come to you with their audiogram, but maybe if they have it, you know, if it's accessible. Did I see another hand over here somewhere? Okay. I have that happen. We go to conference. I have families walk up to me. Can we talk about my child's audiogram? I'm like, yeah, sure, like no problem. We got it. So anyways, we already kind of talked about the conductive hearing loss. So for most folks, they would fall in this range, that 26 to 40, 40 to 50 dB hearing loss, hearing range. You know, different people have different preferences for different terms. For most people, they're going to hear in the majority of situations. They might miss little pieces, like past an ED or a plural or an S. But for the most part, they're going to hear it, they're going to understand. They might occasionally ask for some clarification. You know, they might be sensitive to background noise. Maybe restaurants aren't their favorite place, or they always ask for a booth in the back corner or some of those kinds of things. For some folks with this level of hearing, they don't even know they have a hearing loss. You know, it's never been tested. If you've never had a reason to have this tested, for this amount of loss, maybe you have hearing aids, maybe you don't. We see a lot of hearing aid rejection. You know, they might actually get there to the audiologist and try them, but we often see them reject the hearing aids because now everything is loud and they don't like that. You know, hearing aids have features so they can sort noise and do those kinds of things, but again, it's electronic. It's not perfect. I can't make the noise go away if it's there. I can't, like Bose noise canceling earphone. I can't do that with a hearing aid because you still got to be able to hear the speech. So there's no, because the speech signal and the noise signal overlap and are intermingled, there's no way to purely pull them apart. So just to give you an idea, like 0 to 20, 0 to 25, depending upon who you're reading, is considered normal hearing. Yet a person with an average 30 dB hearing loss could miss 25 to 40% of the speech signal. Question, mild, is that the correct word? You know, like for some people, they really, really struggle with this level of loss. You up that to 40 dB across the board, so like you're kind of taking out all of the frequencies, you're affecting vowels and consonants kind of across the board. 40 dB hearing loss, still considered mild. I could miss 50% of the speech signal. You know, so that's where I caution you with the names, the ranges. The numbers tell you more. Or sitting down with the person and let's talk about this. I do great and quiet. Restaurants are okay. Work noise is terrible. And then you can kind of pick your features and hearing aid things that you need. So now we bump it up a little bit to that 40 to 55, 40 to 60 dB hearing loss, hearing level. So again, if we're close, we're going to do okay. If it's quiet, I'm spot on, I'm good. Maybe I don't even use hearing aids because everything, I'm always within 3 feet of my person that I need to communicate with. But oh gosh, if I got to talk to that person way in the back, I'm going to see their mouth moving, but I'm not going to get it. For this amount of hearing loss, majority of people are noticing that they're having some kind of issue and probably find significant benefit from hearing aids. Because for these folks, I need to bump up a little bit. They need a little bit more volume and maybe not so much distortion with this kind of level of hearing loss. So I just need to give them more access to all those speech sounds and things like that.
So say your spouse does have a hearing issue, will not do anything about it, and the TV's up louder, and you have to talk louder, how much damage would that do to the person that does not have the hearing issue?
Oh, kind of like secondhand smoke,
Yeah.
secondhand noise. You know, I don't know if that one's actually been studied. Maybe we need a research study. Part probably in that realm, it's more in that annoyance factor, that quality of life thing, or, you know, you have a question because the TV is so loud. And I lived this with my dad, God bless his soul. His daughter was an audiologist, tried hearing aids once, could not make it happen. Like, just could not. Like, it didn't happen. And so, yeah, you know, like, I'm sure you find yourself either modifying, or you wait till the show is over and you're sitting down to dinner because then it's going to be quiet and you'll have that conversation. So again, I mean, it would depend on truly how loud, you know, if they're listening to the TV at 100 dB, you know, my dad's TV, I didn't even know it could go up to 50 something, you know. So then you're going to talk to Laura, who will get you the TV ears or whatever, and then he can just plug in and everybody else doesn't have to do it. So, but again, you have to get them to that point where they even notice that there's an issue. Yeah. Marriage counseling is also an option too. But again, you know, that's a situational, so you can change. You can add technology. You could modify the environment, or you can always go do something else at that moment. You know, so yeah, how will you do that? So again, you know, taking notes. So now we've crossed the levels from mild to moderate. So that 40 dB, we talked about missing the 50%. So 50 dB hearing loss, we still got a long way to go. I can have 120 dB hearing loss. So with 50 dB, you could miss 80% of the speech. You know, so you might be hearing the vowels, or kind of like those words like hot dog, if say uh-oh. You probably could figure it out if you knew the context that I was talking about, but you gotta be working really hard to get the information, you know, because I always tell, teachers often tell us, they hear me. I'm like, but hearing me and understanding me are two different things, you know, so you never say to, I never say to them, did you hear me? I'm always asking, like, what did I say? You know, my husband probably gets mad at me, but I'm like, I need you to repeat that back to me because I need to make sure we're on the same page. You know what I mean? And it happens to anybody you interact with. You can hear very different messages. We often laugh at our staff meetings. Like, I don't know, sometimes we think we're having two meetings because people come out with two different messages. You know, so for kids, once you get to this level of 40, 50 dB hearing loss, you will start to see some speech impact, some language learning impact. For these kids, when they're found early, sometimes the hearing aids alone are enough to give them that boost, and they are just on par with their peers, and they go forward. Other kids, yeah, great, I can hear more, but I still don't know what to do with it. So then they might need some amount of intervention. Socialization can be impacted. So this is where you might start to see adults withdraw, or preferring one-on-one, or I'm going to play chess in the park, I'm not going to go to the restaurant. Like, and it's not even conscious. Like, it's just you sort of start to choose different activities or withdraw from some of those things that you were doing. And again, kind of like we talked about, like, it takes a lot of effort to listen with this level of hearing loss. It's exhausting. And so we talk to schools about, you know, don't put their hardest class at the end of the day. Don't. It's just not fair. They're not going to do well. So, you know, shuffle the schedule a little bit. So now, if we talk about a 55 to 70 dB hearing loss, so again, kind of moving down the audiogram, the graph, for most people with this amount of hearing loss, in very quiet, perfect conditions, probably doing a lot with facial features and lip reading, might be okay with amplification, but for many, they're just not going to get enough speech information to be able to have those conversations and things. So, you know, again, depending on that individual, that family, sometimes just adding visuals or caption, you know, visuals so they get some more information is enough. We know many folks who use American Sign Language or some type or amount of sign language, or, you know, it just depends. Maybe they use it just receptively just to get the information, but they respond, you know, speaking for themselves. You know, depending on the environment, probably will need some kind of assistive technology. If a child has this amount of hearing loss at birth, they're going to need some pretty significant supports. They're going to need speech and language. The family's going to have to, almost all learning has to become intentional. And I'm sure if you have children or nieces and nephews, you've been visiting or sitting there and you're like, where would they have ever heard that word? You know, and, you know, like, I can't even come up with one, you know, like, but it comes across on a TV show or a radio, and they're just using it in their speech. They got it, they use it, and they move forward. For kids with hearing loss, particularly this level of hearing loss, they don't pick up all that stuff that's happening around them unless they're actually focused, being taught, making it intentional. They lose all of that stuff, and then that's kind of where you can find some of those social pieces come into play, because they didn't get the rules. Or, you know, kids make up rules for a game, and within 3 minutes, the rule has changed, and we've taken this game that I know, like, oh, my mom taught me this game. I know Chutes and Ladders or Candyland or whatever, but we're going to make it, when you get doubles, you actually get 4 space, or what, you know, whatever. And so they miss that kind of more subtle stuff, or those quick changes. And for folks with this amount of hearing loss, again, depending on distance or size, or, you know, you're in a big conference, electronic amplified voice may not be good. You might use something like captioning. So then Lisa asked me to, you know, talk about what's the difference between hard of hearing, deaf, profound hearing loss. It can, and again, depending on your perspective and how you approach this, it can be a medical definition, it can be a numbers definition, or it could be a personal, internal family cultural choice. You know, so we have, you know, lots of folks that we know are somewhere in this 70 to 120. That's what the 90 plus means. Like, so they're at the lower end of the audiogram. So if I measure their hearing, that's where my numbers would be. But, you know, we know many people who maybe have a 70 dB hearing loss who choose not to use speech because it's not easy for them, it's not clear. You know, again, in most situations, they know they're going to miss information, so they would much rather use an interpreter and have full access to the information. They may prefer to use captioning because, again, they know just listening that there will be gaps, there will be pieces missing just because their system doesn't allow them access to all of that information. So, again, depending upon what you're reading, who you're working with, it can be a medical numerical definition, or it can be a personal definition. So just like we have many kids who use cochlear implants who identify themselves as deaf, like, you know, but you're like, but you now have some usable hearing. So again, it's not a one size fits all. It's not a, you know, it's a very personal choice. If you pick little d, big D, that's a cultural piece. With this amount of hearing loss for children, when we know they have it, there's going to be some amount of intervention, whether that's all sign language instruction. And again, it varies. If you are born into a deaf family that has American Sign Language and that's their natural language, and that's the language that works for you, everything will be equal because you are getting that language. So really, for most kids with hearing loss, it's that language piece. How do we get the language into them? Okay. So we're getting pretty close here. So I'm just going to give you a couple kinds of amplification options, and then we should have a couple minutes for any remaining questions when we're done. And again, any one of these sections, we could have taken the whole 90 minutes to talk about just one of the sections. So really, I hope I met the goal of just kind of to give you a gloss and give you an idea of where folks will be coming to when they come to you. All right, so I kind of just lumped all those things together, hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone conduction hearing aids, into one thing. Amplification is just kind of a global term. Really, what's the goal for us with amplification is to take different levels of speech, whether it's soft, one-on-one, average, moderate speech, or loud sounds. You know, you're out at the subway or on the playground. We don't want to equally amplify that in the same way that we would do soft one-on-one speech. In today's amplification, all of those different options let you do this. In the past, it was just whatever went in got equally louder. They were called analog hearing aids. It just, whatever went in got louder. Didn't matter, speech, noise, everybody got louder. Well, now the technology is so smart. It's really smart technology, just like your smartphone knows if you're always going to Domino's, that's the first pizza place that's going to pop up. The amplification can do the same thing. We can set those different levels because we know you're going to be in different environments. You're going to need those different access points. Yes?
Actually, perfect. your hair was creating feedback on
Oh.
your microphone.
Sorry.
Test.
All right. All right. Okay. Sorry. See, talk about access. Thank you for letting me know rather than just suffering through it.
And I'm sorry, we are going to have to use the mic for questions, so
Okay.
bear with me as I run towards you feverishly with the...
Yes, because we need our captionist to be able to hear, to be able to answer the question. So that's where you may see question and nothing there. But so with any amplification that we choose, we want to make all three of those levels accessible and comfortable. We don't want loud to suddenly be too loud. And we can do that electronically with amplification now. And what sounds are we looking at? Well, we're looking at speech. I mean, that's our most important target. That's what we want, is for that to be audible and understandable. Just because I can put it in your range doesn't mean it's going to be clear. And then environmental sounds. You know, so hearing aids, you have noise canceling, you have wind noise, noise reduction. There's all these features you can turn on and off and you can adjust. But you still need to know those sounds that are going on around you because they're important. They bring you information, such as a siren or whatever. But at the same time, those are really loud. So we need to make sure that we're not blowing you out of the water. And really, I kind of touched on this before, the goal is language, is really we want to build the brain. We want things going in. We want kids making connections. And really, as providers, it's our goal to figure out what's the best way in for that kid. Because again, 2 kids, same hearing loss, not necessarily the same way in. So for hearing aids, I'm just going to show a picture. This was a new one. I hadn't seen the word invisible. So again, kids don't wear many of these, so I appreciate the opportunity to just kind of refresh my memory because, you know, we do one thing for kids and sometimes adults are doing different. But I will just show you, I found this. I love the internet because you can, I mean, I mean that honestly, because you can get to information, you know, I think about how different grad school and different things at different points of my life would be. But same thing, I had old pictures, but I'm like, oh, you know, look at YouTube, I love YouTube. You know, so just to give you an idea, is for kids, the reason you don't see some of these smaller, I'm going to just show you this, where's my arrow? So this one, invisible. So you can just kind of see. You can't see it from the outside. It actually has a little piece of filament or fishing wire, essentially, is the best analogy, so that you can actually pull that out of your ear. They're that tiny. And then, so any of these as well. So in the canal, you can see it's smaller. You just see it flush with the ear. Completely in the canal just kind of cuts it out a little bit more. And in the ear makes it a little bit bigger. For kids, these are not usually an option. One, for safety, because these are hard plastic. And then also because kids grow, they change size. As an adult, you can get this, you could wear this hearing aid if your hearing didn't change 10, 20 years. But for kids, because their size is always changing, they need something a little more flexible that's going to change size-wise with them.
Are they all the same quality of sound?
Yes, I would say they are all the same quality of sound. What may vary is the feature. So this afternoon, Laura will talk about a feature called a telecoil. In these teeniest tiny ones, the invisible or in the canal, there's just not enough space in the housing to add some of those features. But anything with the soft, medium, and loud sound you can do on any of these. You can adjust them to match the hearing loss, all of those kinds of things. So most kids have this, what we call a behind the ear, because of this piece, the ear mold that goes in their ear. Way cheaper to remake that than completely recase a hearing aid and do all of those kinds of things. So they come apart. So you can continuously, babies have this change every 3 months or less, or 3 to 6 months because they're growing so much. But adults, I've seen some pretty scary ear molds on we'll just say elderly gentlemen who they've had them a long time. But again, and then this is kind of one of the newest styles that's available. This one is, here they call it, you'll see it either as receiver in the canal, RIC, or receiver in the ear, right. I hadn't seen this right. Usually they're called RICs. But what happens is normally the microphone for the hearing aid, or this style, is here on the hearing aid. So like you're picking up the sound here. So you don't get the benefit of your ear canal, the outer part of your ear. This kind, they've actually put the little microphone down there on the piece that goes in your ear. So it more closely mimics natural hearing. And again, it kind of depends on your hearing loss, which of these you can use. The most significant hearing losses, some of these little guys just can't have enough power. So you have to go more to a traditional behind the ear.
I just wanted to add, I just wanted to say the receiver in the mold.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
She loves it.
I have it in both ears, and I've been using all different kinds of hearing aids, and I got this 4 years ago, and I've been loving it ever since. But I do have one curious question. Are analog hearing aids still out there?
No.
They're completely off the shelf now.
Yeah, so Carolyn's, first she shared that she's gone to the receiver in the ear, so it puts it in kind of using those natural features, loves it because of those. You wouldn't think that all of this had purpose, but it does. It funnels the sound, it kind of, uses the frequency information that's happening around you, so loves them, and so again, technology gets better and better, so you can use some of this littler technology with much more significant hearing losses than you could even 10 years ago. So just like you can put your phone on your watch now or whatever, same thing for hearing aids. And then the second part of her question was, do analog hearing aids still exist? They probably still exist for some of those folks who've been using them for 20 years and won't give them up, but you can't purchase them anymore. You cannot go in as a new hearing aid user and get those. You can't buy them anymore. So that's hearing aids. We're just going to do quick cochlear implant. I'm going to do the video because it's just a minute. This will just give you a general idea of the process for cochlear implant.
How the new...
Oops, sorry. Oops, and our Wi-Fi is buffering. So we'll see. You talk about technology changing. I put this new link in this presentation 2 days ago, so actually the link in your PowerPoint is incorrect. And I always replay my presentations the night before because I just, I need to know it's going to work, and I'm guessing we're not going to get it. So we'll see if it's happier here. Okay, there we go. But it had changed.
How the nucleus cochlear implant system works. The nucleus cochlear implant system is designed to mimic the functions of the human ear. Sound travels to your ear and the sound processor, which sits behind the ear. The microphones on the sound processor pick up sounds, and the processor converts them into digital information. This information is transferred through the coil to the implant just under the skin. The implant sends digital sound signals down the electrode into the cochlea. The hearing nerve fibers in the cochlea pick up the signals and send them to the brain, which is translated as the sound you hear. Unlike a hearing aid that simply amplifies sound, cochlear implants send sound directly to the hearing nerve and on to the brain.
So again, we had a request to turn off the captioning because it was actually double captioning, so it was overlapping each other. So again, just to give you a different idea, a little bit of information about how cochlear implant works a little bit differently than a hearing aid. There are only 3 companies in the world that make cochlear implants: Advanced Bionics, Cochlear America, and Med-El. So to just give you a little bit of statistics, about 324,000 worldwide. In the U.S., about 58,000 adults and 38,000 children. We could have a whole day on talking about kind of that cultural piece, connections to cochlear implants and those kinds of things. Again, my purpose was just simply to let you know they exist and how they're being used. And so you can kind of see a similarity. The shape, this is the sound processor. This is actually a little mini computer that takes all the sound and information in and then transmit it across the coil into the surgically implanted piece that's under the skin. So all 3 very similar, different features, just like hearing aids. You can connect things. Some are Bluetooth. Some you can answer your phone with your cochlear implant without connecting anything. lots of advances in the technology. One of the ones that, and then I'm actually going to show you the pictures first. So this is one I had them in, I keep going back and forth, pictures or words first. But to give you an idea, so bone-anchored hearing aid, you might sometimes hear of people having a BAHA, which was actually the original kind of acronym for bone-anchored hearing aid. But BAHA is actually owned now by Cochlear America. That is the name of their bone-anchored hearing aid. So, so you can see this one, Oticon, has one called a Ponto. There's one other company that I'm aware of called, not Sephora, that's the makeup place. Safano is another bone conduction manufacturer. But again, pretty small pool of manufacturers. But what happens is for, you see for kids with atresia or anatomical differences, this is a way in, kind of like her earphones, that uses bone conduction. It doesn't need to go through all the parts of the ear, but is specific, and they can do an implant, this little titanium, they put this little piece into the mastoid, and then eventually the little external piece, whether it's BAHA, Cochlear product, or Ponto, snaps right on. And so it's used for people with structural differences. It's used for single-sided deafness, so some of those folks who have normal hearing and no hearing, by putting it on that on your non-hearing side, it actually vibrates your skull and puts the information into your good ear so you can hear on this side. And again, some people never know. Some people can't stand that they can't hear what's happening on that side. So again, some of those anatomical things, middle ear things. For kids, because their skull hasn't reached a maturation thickness, that's where you see the soft bands, like the little pink band that the girl had. Sometimes you see them on the side. Sometimes for little bitty kids, they move them because the skull is still soft. So you might see a kid in a stroller, and same thing, you're in a stroller or a baby carrier, you might actually see the BAHAs up here in the front. And again, so that surgery is surgeon specific, like 5, 6 years old. You might see the kids actually have it. Some kids just stay with the band. They like it. It works. So they don't go to the surgery part. And then I just wanted to put this one out here because it's the newest coming off the assembly line kind of thing. It's called an auditory brainstem implant. Fairly rare for the conditions that this would happen. So perhaps the person is born without cochleas or without an auditory nerve. So if you don't have a cochlea or an auditory nerve, we can't use a cochlear implant because it needs that piece. So this one, you can see, bypasses the cochlea and actually goes into the auditory nerve. It's new. They're just starting this. It's in clinical trials with children. I've been doing this a long time. Have met one family that this has been mentioned as a possibility. And what they see is that you have sound awareness, maybe some speech recognition, but it's pretty low numbers. It's not, it's not like a cochlear implant where we know we're going to get a lot of information for that person. So again, this family chose not to. They decided to use American Sign Language and visual communication and not try this tool, but that's what it is. It's a tool. So this is just what's coming down the way. So that's it in a nutshell. So any other questions from all of that information that I'm sure has your head spinning?
So depending on what cochlear implant brand, that's the one you have to stick with for the rest of your life if you had that piece implanted? Excellent question.
Yes, so the internal pieces are specific to the manufacturer. So yeah, if you start with cochlear, unless they surgically remove it and give you a new internal piece, you can't switch back and forth. What's really cool though is, so say for cochlear, it used to be Nucleus 24, and they've had all these different names. For each individual manufacturer, they are backwards compatible. So the technology you have today, you can change that outside part as it becomes smarter, but that inside part is like generations ahead. We'll recognize that. And really, like the only ones where they haven't been able to go all the way back were the very first 1980s generations that came out, because that technology was nowhere near. But so yeah, so you can continually be upgrading this outside feature part, but that inside stays for a long time. But you're right, you can't go between manufacturers.
So the magnet goes on the implant is the size of a $50, I'm guessing, or a quarter. So is that the size of the implant as well? So to me, that looks like it would be a pretty invasive surgery, or do they do that pretty
And let's see if I
simply?
have the picture in here. So this little piece on the bottom is the coil. And so this little piece is kind of like the computer piece that's under the skin. And then this is the little magnet, and then it's encased in some kind of supersonic plastic. I don't know what. But it's rubbery, it's soft. And then these are the electrodes that actually get snailed into the cochlea so that you can hear. So, I mean, it's a day surgery. People, adults go home the same day. Sometimes they even send kids to home the same day, but they often keep them just overnight because it's a surgery. So they have to kind of hollow out that bone a little bit, and then it recesses. But from the outside, like if you don't have the coil on or the processor, you can't see it then. So, okay. Any last questions before we finish?
Yes.
We're about 5 over.
Yes, I have a question. Are there any studies about the success rate that they're able not just to hear sound, but to understand sound and understand speech? Is there any results or testing statistics on that data?
And so I'm just specific to cochlear implants?
Yes, hearing aids or cochlear implants. Like what's the success rate for actual understanding or having word recognition and all that, not just hearing sounds?
There's lots and lots of studies because that's part of it. Again, we could have done a lot more time on cochlear implants. You have to have a certain level of hearing loss, and you have to have minimal speech understanding, like very low, less than 20%, 30% speech understanding, to even be considered to get a cochlear implant. And then they measure after the fact. So they do many more of those kind of word recognition and speech testing in the cochlear implant recipients, because they want to know how much benefit have they received, how much word understanding do they have. And really for the cochlear implants, they do a much better job with high frequency information, which is where all the consonants are, and hearing aids do better with lower frequency. Sometimes some of the hearing aids aren't so great with the high frequencies, but yes, there are journals and tons of research that show, because for them to be approved by the FDA, by the Food and Drug Administration, they have to be able to show that they're beneficial. So there's lots. So I have on the end, if you have specific questions or want specific resources or more about just a part of what we've talked about today, just shoot me an email. I'll find you something that's useful to answer your questions. And then we have a whole bunch of ways to connect with outreach through social media. So Facebook, Twitter, we have an email list. So if you just want to know what kinds of events and things we have coming up, you can join us there. So, all right.
Great. Thank you very much. That was awesome. All right. We are going to take a 15-minute break. We have 10:52 now, so we'll see you about 17.